Roxanne Towner-Watkins here with War Hamster Brady, bringing you another session of secret societies, focusing initially on skull and bones. How are you doing, Brady?
I am doing about as good as could be expected. I'm freezing and getting married in 2 days, so lots going on.
Congrats.
Thank you.
So you had some news for us.
Yeah, about 2 minutes before I jumped on to our show here, I had the War Room on in the background, and Steve Bannon announced that Mitch McConnell is retiring from the Senate, apparently effective immediately. So that's good news.
Well, yes, but some people may immediately make the observation that you did in the fact that it had they have a Democrat governor and they appoint the replacement. But tell us what you found out about that.
Yeah, apparently the Kentucky legislature, which is a Republican leaning, put a bill in place a few years back that said the governor doesn't get to choose anyone he wants. He's got to choose from a list of 3 candidates that the legislature gives him. So Democrat governor is not going to be able to put a Democrat to replace Mitch with. So that is good news.
Yes, that's very good news.
Yeah, let's hope Kentucky gets it right next time they get a major election. They got we have so many red states that send the worst senators, and I'm thinking about South Carolina, Kentucky, et cetera. Like some of the absolute worst come from some of the states where it's the most rock solid, red states. And
but isn't that more to do with election interference and machines as opposed to the votes?
No, I think what it has to do is with the state GOP, because that's really the state GOP controls who is going to get nominated, who basically gets the state GOP backing, funding, everything like that. I mean, we saw that in California, left and right. So grassroots is almost impossible to get the state GOP, and that's why it's so incumbent over these next 2 to 4 years of really pushing the national precinct strategy. The 400,000, the party is run by precincts. By the precinct committeemen. There's about 400,000 of those positions around the country. Every state's got different rules. Over 200,000 of those seats are empty. I mean, you can just walk, the grassroots good patriots could just walk right in, and you change the GOP at your state level. You change it at the local level. You get it up to the district level, and then you get to the state level, and you can actually change the entire state GOP. And there's a huge movement to do that. I'm kind of helping some groups organize that. And we'll be talking more about that later. But, that's really the key. If you want to stop getting rhinos in the Senate, you got to fix it locally. You got to take over the GOP.
Good observation. And what a wonderful effort. If you could, and that's kind of my bitch about the Republican Party in general. Obviously, they had the rhinos at the very top of it as well, and never came up with a strategy. It's not for lack of money. There's money there, but you have the people in charge that want to leave it the way it is. And all it would take is a grassroots effort, but all of the people with big platforms are there for their specific platform and to make millions off of their platform and not better the country. And of course, not being afraid to name names, the very first organization that comes to my mind is CPAC. What better organization with name recognition to organize something like you just outlined? Do they do it? No. What better organization to do it than Turning Points, with all of their colleges all over the United States and foot soldiers to get out there and make this happen? Do they do it? No. So when you start looking at the people who have these platforms that could make incredible progress and leaders above them, we have plenty of conservative retired general officers that could orchestrate something like this. Just look at what General Flynn did with saving children. They have the leadership skills to do it. They were paid to do that for 40 years, given the best training there is. And some of them have platforms big enough to do it, but they don't.
It's interesting what you said about going to CPAC. The America First Precinct Strategy Committee that I'm working with my company, Revolution Harbor, we're providing them a platform to organize on. They're at CPAC. Leo Zaki, who ran for governor in 2022, you can see an interview with him on my channel from 3 years ago now, is now running for governor again next cycle. We are working with Leo as well. Leo's at CPAC. He's probably already spoke. He's like the second speaker on the big stage. We sent a camera crew out there with Leo and the America First Precinct Strategy to CPAC, and we are making those connections as we speak. The only reason I'm not there is because I'm getting married in 2 days, and it would be probably a bad idea to be flying in the night before. But yeah, that's actually exactly what you suggested is going on. We're making that happen in real time on the ground, and you're going to meet so many awesome grassroots patriots from all over the country, and it's been really fun being a part of it. So.
Yeah, there was a guy, a January 6th guy, Richard Big O Barnett, that also scraped together money. He just got his January 6th pardon, scraped the money together to go to CPAC, and CPAC won't let him in.
Yeah, I heard that last night. Jake Lang was on a couple of shows last night talking about how he couldn't get in. Some of the Proud Boys didn't get in, etc. I had J6er Brian Mock on my channel a few weeks ago, and he's got a great story. He's a really good guy. He's considered one of the violent 81 of the most violent, and he got his pardon. All he did was push back when that big glass shield was pushed at him. He tells the story pretty well. He's there at CPAC. He was with Jake Lang the night before. Wasn't with him last night when they failed to get in, but yeah. They're keeping some of the J6ers out. Jake Lang is controversial for other reasons. I'm not going to get into that. I don't want to litigate his situation. Other people can do that. But it is interesting that it is not wide open doors to everyone.
Yeah. But if they allow you to buy tickets, they damn sure better let you in.
Yeah. I think we're going to hear a lot more fallout on that situation.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get into your material.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to actually finishing up with Skull and Bones. So, the big transition is we're talking about secret societies, and the reason we're doing it, you started your podcasting career talking about Operation Gladio. And so we've kind of shifted into, okay, so who are the ones who created the structures and the ideas and the plans for Gladio? And that sort of led us towards Skull and Bones, and all of their alumni, have just one inside club of intermarriages, interconnected brotherhood, all from Yale University and the secret society. And they run the intel agencies, the State Department. They've been presidents of the United States, secretaries of state, Supreme Court justices, CEOs on every war board, etc. They're just everywhere. What I'm looking forward to as we transition to it, because what we've basically described as the Eastern establishment, Yankees. That's basically these people. Very few exceptions of these are not Eastern establishment. This is the class system. But how'd they get that way, and where did they learn these ideas? Well, they got it from across the pond with it's called the Anglo-American rules-based order for a reason. And I'm looking forward to transitioning to jumping into the biggest secret societies in England, which basically, big picture, just call it the Fabian Socialists or the Fabian Society. And I have got some great stuff to share about that.
Which, of course, gave birth to Operation Gladio.
Absolutely. That's where the ideas come from. And as I was doing that research, someone asked me, well, what's the oldest intelligence agency? And, you can almost go back to the Oracle of Delphi and the other occult seers from Greece days. No ruler would go to war without consulting with these people, and you'd have to pay them. And so they get the secrets of every ruler, who's going to attack where, and they tell them whether to attack or not, and everything like that. And they have their own little network, spy network, these occult leaders. That was the first intel agency. And you see the connections throughout the ages, and it makes a ton of sense.
And I just published the thing that I was looking at into the occult nature of all of this stuff in the Nazi Party, that Viril organization. So It does. It just makes perfect sense as you walk through history and you realize, and obviously, kind of the juxtaposition of that in some respects is William Colby, James Angleton, all commenting on how the Catholic Church has the best intel organization in the entire world during the 40s and 50s because of confessions and being able to then take that information that people confess in the confessional and then use it to the advantage of the church in general.
Yeah, which makes a ton of sense. You go back in medieval times, for 1,000 years in Europe, basically the firstborn son would inherit the land, the secondborn son would go to the church, and the thirdborn son would go to the military. Well, this is how you control a population. It's exactly it. And
of course, that is one of the things that came over here. If you go back and look at the Rockefellers and a lot of them, the Donovan family, a lot of them come from clergy.
Oh, yeah. We talked about the very beginning of the Skull and Bones. Yeah. Is an awful lot of them are the Puritan or Protestant, I would say, but originally Puritans that would descend, they have Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopalian, all of that stuff. And 100%. Real quick, there's a comment in the chat on Rumble from Joyce Holly. It says, CanCon, and I did watch a bit of that. That's where I saw that with Jake Lang. I was watching CanCon for like 5 minutes last night. He said he had Jake Lang on his show last night, and he thinks it's because Jake is running for an office in Florida. And I don't know if that makes sense or not. It might,
Well, I can guarantee you CanCon didn't have him on there because he was running for office. But there may be that correlation. CanCon has been very, very supportive of all of the January 6th and will have any of them on his show in order for them to tell their story.
Yeah, CanCon's great.
Yeah.
I had another J6er that most people haven't heard of on my show 2 days ago by the name of Ty Slaker. And he wasn't a major criminal or anything like that. He's got caught with trespassing, did 30 days home confinement. What's interesting about him, and he's got, first of all, he had some audio. He spent a lot of time on January 5th and 6th in contact with Ray Epps. And his story, which I let him tell on my channel, is that Ray Epps was not a Fed. He was actually trying to calm things down. Everybody on the streets was trying to go into the Capitol. And Ray was saying, okay, you do it, but you do it peacefully. And that's what Ty's testimony is, I already said on my channel, which is interesting. And it ticks off a lot of people because it breaks a lot of the narrative. But the audio tape backs it up to some degree. So I'm keeping an open mind on that subject.
So I had an A-10 pilot on my podcast by the name of Larry Brock, and a lot of people haven't heard his story either. He was Senate's, he's a Air Force retired lieutenant colonel. He was an airline pilot. He was flying for a private company during that time, and he has a very interesting story. The most interesting aspect of it is the evilness of our federal government, not in convicting a lieutenant colonel that had served for 30 years in the military, obviously not a domestic terrorist, of being basically a domestic terrorist, but they put him in a federal penitentiary in Missouri and then shipped in to sleep in the bed next to him, not somewhere in the general prison, in the bed next to him, an Al-Qaeda operative. Now, if you know what A-10 drivers do, they are close air support for Army. They look you in the eye as they put their Gatling gun on you and kill you. And he had flown combat missions against Al-Qaeda on multiple occasions, and these son of a bitches put an Al-Qaeda operative in the federal prison system, sleeping in the bed next to a veteran.
Was that at the DC Gulag? Was that at the Gulag at DC?
No, that was in the Missouri Federal Penitentiary. The Missouri guards, the lower guys on the, that actually was like the Bay guys, they threw a fit. And within a couple of days, they mounted such an effort to the 3 top people in that prison, which facilitated that happening, that they got that Al-Qaeda guy moved.
It took 2 days.
It took 3 or 4 days.
Oh, great. Well, we got it's another thing we need to fix is our penal system. And I think I want a serious investigation into the DC gulag after the stories we've heard about how our guys were treated.
I want it closed. It should be against the law to have any kind of a jail in DC.
Well, we don't even think there should be a DC district court. It is not a state. Yeah, it's not. That should not have that jurisdiction at all. And get rid of its electoral vote. DC was never meant to be. There weren't even supposed to be citizens and residents in DC. It was only supposed to be a place to go to work.
Correct.
And what happened is the politicians in DC, you'd have all these freed slaves or escaped slaves, and they'd go right to DC, and the politicians loved it. They get their cheap labor, and that's how. Then they built up the residential area of Washington DC, of the District of Columbia. But it was never supposed to happen. They were not supposed to be permanent residents. So, oh well. We'll fix that again.
Well, that's why Virginia took all of their part of it, of the original district back, because it actually went on the other side of the river initially.
Yep. Oh, we may as well do it since we're on the topic. And the only reason DC is where it is, which just happens to be adjacent to George Washington's estate, which was what was his name of his estate? Mount Vernon. Right next to it. Well, that was part of the allegedly was part of the deal when Hamilton basically was negotiating to get the first Bank of the United States, which is unconstitutional. But we digress. We've gone down some rabbit holes already. Let's go into the topic.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right, as usual, going through chronological order for the most part, the list of Skull and Bones members, and we left off with the Hines family. Actually left off with John Kerry, who married into the Hines family. Next interesting name that jumps out at us, and this is one most people probably have not heard of, is a guy by the name of Lewis Abbott Lapham. That's Lapham, and he was a bonesman class of 1931. I want to tell you about his family before we talk about him. He is the grandson of a gentleman by the name of Lewis Henry Lapham, who lived from 1858 to 1934. Lewis Henry makes his money, made his fortune consolidating businesses in the leather industry. This next part gets fun. He was a founding investor in 1899 in a company called the American Hawaiian Steamship Company.
Uh-oh.
Colonel, you want to tell us why that's a significant place and year?
Because we stole Hawaii by overthrowing the Queen.
In what year? 1898. And this guy just happened. What's that?
I said, holy crap, this is so crazy.
Yeah, it's the same people. They all at this small little club, and they're the ones who basically play the chessboards all around the world. So this guy gets better, Mr. Lewis Henry. He's the co-founder of a company that became Texaco. One of the basins of Texas discovered oil. They made a ton of money, these Texas Wildcatters. These are the original cowboys. When you start talking about the Yankees and Cowboys, these are the original ones from Texaco.
Wow.
So Texaco, this is right after this guy passed away, but let's talk about Texaco. In 1936, Texaco, it was called the Texas Corporation at the time, they bought a company called Barco Oil. It was called the Barco Oil Concession in Colombia, joint venture with Mobil. So now they're in Latin America. In Colombia.
When was that?
That was 1936.
So that was after we stole Panama for Colombia.
Yes.
Okay.
Texaco then would illegally supply the fascist nationalist faction in the Spanish Civil War with about 3.5 million barrels of oil. That's in the 1930s.
That's interesting.
They got fined for that. Got fined $20,000 for violating the Neutrality Act of 1937. So we've got a U.S. corporation working with fascists in Europe. Does that ring a bell?
What? Was that the first of a trend? Because it went on for, I don't know, forever now?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Exactly what the Harrimans were doing with the Nazis. Yes.
Yes. Holy crap. War hamster. That's amazing.
There's more to this for the Texaco story. They did a joint venture with a company that would eventually become Chevron, known as Standard Oil of California. And they did, that Rockefellers enter the chat. And they would enter into the Bahrainian oil industry together. Middle East, of course. And no shenanigans ever took place regarding that. Okay, so Texaco in 1939, their CEO is a guy by the name of Torkild Reiber, R-I-E-B-E-R. Have you run into him before?
No, not that I remember.
All right, well, keep an eye out for that name in the future because it's interesting. He hired some pro-Nazi assistants, and they were busy cabling Berlin coded information about the ships that are leaving New York Harbor.
Oh, I did hear about that. I just didn't realize that name was associated with it. I'll have to do a search. Spell that last name again because I have my notes, most of them electronically.
R-I-E-B-E-R.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah, I thought you might have been across your radar. I definitely know about, I knew you would know about the coded info about the ships because that led us to Operation Underworld directly.
Correct. Huh.
All along, you're a step ahead of me. I'm going to get there.
Yeah, he's always a step ahead.
Talk about Harper's Magazine. Good job all along. I'll get there in a minute. All right, so going on further with Torkild Reiber, he gets forced to resign when that's found out. But Life magazine runs a huge story about it, portraying it as a very unfair. And who owned Life magazine?
Luce.
Skull and Bonesman Henry Luce.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Oh my gosh.
All right, a little more on Texaco because it's a fascinating story. Great corporation. 1982, they would meet with Medellin cartel members, including Pablo Escobar, to form a paramilitary organization known as Muerte a Secuestradores, which is death to... Shoot, I used to know that. Anyways, they were working with the Medellin cartel paramilitary. This is Texaco, a Fortune 500 company.
Which means they are working with the CIA.
Well, yes, obviously. By this time, the guy we started with was Skull and Bones 1931. So, he knows all these.
Are you saying it goes without saying?
Yes. The interesting part about Muerte de Secuestradores, by 1983, Colombia had estimated over 240 political killings. And this is a U.S. corporation involved in that. 1987, Texaco would go bankrupt. They had to pay a $10.5 billion verdict for interfering in Gordon Getty's sale of Getty Oil to Pennzoil. In 1989, Texaco reformed, and they did a joint venture with Saudi Aramco for the rest of the remains of Texaco's U.S. refining and marketing operation. Go ahead and make some commentary. I'm going to pull something up on my screen, and I did not have it.
Go ahead and make some. Well, I had went back, and I wanted to make sure that everybody understands the connection of where we started with this, and that is with this Roger Lepham, or however you say his last name. Not only did he own a shipping company, but he also was the mayor of San Francisco. And of course, that's very, very important for lots of different reasons, because San Francisco was basically like the New York City of the West Coast.
Yeah, and we're gonna get back to San Francisco here in a second. So do you mind holding that thought?
Well, I just was saying that because I want to go to talk just a second about the actual steamship company that he owned and why that's so significant. Because the whole stealing of Hawaii revolved around sugar plantations. They didn't even have pineapple at the time. That came later. They were sugar plantations. And what's most interesting to me about that is how sugar, this evil substance that we now know causes cancer, not only was in Hawaii and centered around the stealing of Hawaii, with the missionaries there turned sugar plantation harvesters who had tens of thousands of Chinese slaves on the island of Hawaii harvesting the sugar plantations. That is what is so prominent in Cuba and in Puerto Rico and throughout the Caribbean and Latin America, is sugar, because William Polly owned several sugar plantations on.
Uh-oh, did she freeze?
There you go. It showed it was gone out of mine. So anyway, I just wanted to go back and reiterate how important sugar is to this whole thing, and these steamships, because whether it's opium in Southeast Asia or sugar out of Hawaii, these steamships are critical to the flow, especially early in the 1900s.
And San Francisco is going to be a big theme of our stars today. So I'm glad you're focused in on that, because it's going to come up again. One last little thing about the gentleman we were discussing, Mr. Lewis Henry. He also happens to be the maternal grandfather of an actor by the name of Christopher Lloyd. And if you don't know who that is,
oh my gosh,
here he is. You want to pull him up?
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
It's Doc Brown. Yep.
Oh my gosh. That is so funny.
Yeah, another fun family connection there is Christopher Lloyd, so his other side of the family, is actually a descendant of Mayflower passenger John Howland. So, small world stuff.
Wow.
I had to throw that in there when I saw it. All right. That's it for Mr. Lewis Henry Lapham, his connection with Texaco, which, of course, he owns shares with the whole family. That's part of the family fortune. His son is interesting. His son was a guy named Roger Dearborn Lapham, who lived from 1883 to 1966. He's born in New York. He went to Harvard, but he's interesting. He was a member of what's known as the Pacific Union Club in San Francisco. The family moved there when he was young. His that's their secret society or private club in San Francisco on Nob Hill. There was the Pacific Club and the Union Club, and they merged together. They're still a club to this day. It's a men-only secret society.
Isn't that big mansion?
Yes.
Yes,
exactly.
I've seen it.
Their most famous alumni is probably Caspar Weinberger. That's not quite that skull and bones who's who, but there's a lot of people. If you are a mover and shaker in San Francisco, you need to be a member of this club. Right. And being men only in progressive San Francisco is tough to pull off, but they do it. So Roger Dearborn is a member of that. He's a World War I captain of the infantry with the American Expeditionary Forces. In 1925, he becomes the president of the American Hawaiian Steamship Company that his father had co-purchased. There's a fun story about him in 1927. He co-founds what's called the Cypress Point Golf Course on the Monterey Peninsula, very famous. Funny story about his son and Bobby Jones playing golf together, but we're not doing sports commentary. So in 1936, there's a thing going on in San Francisco called the Waterfront Strike, and he champions the employer side, not the strikers, and that was important. Because in World War II, he becomes the industry representative, the only representative from industry on the National War Labor Board. So, interesting history with this guy and labor.
Well, interesting only in the fact that it replicates every other international syndicate that pleads that they're all for unions and the workers, while in action does nothing for either.
Yeah. Where am I? So he resigns from the National War Labor Board and decides to run for mayor. He said he was only going to run for mayor one time, and he actually stuck to his word. He was the mayor of San Francisco 1944 to 1948. He was trying to scrap the cable car system.
Wait a minute. in that 1944, that would be right as the war's ending.
Yes. Yes.
So, Cousin It did some research, which I don't have published yet, into all of the Asian people that got interned in the West in these internment camps, and how at the end, which would have been around the time that he was mayor, all of their belongings was basically permanently confiscated. They didn't get their property back. They didn't get their houses back. The state of California, in large part, basically just stole all their shit. So that's kind of interesting.
And expected.
And expected.
And if you know how San Francisco is just like, what you call it, the New York of the East Coast, or the Boston of the East Coast?
Yeah, I think it's the New York of the West Coast.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about San Francisco is it's probably one of the biggest, most insider games, political machines you've ever seen.
Which
that's where
is New York.
It's where the Gavin Newsoms and Pelosi's and all those people come from, and it's really basically five families that really control California. And I've been working on doing a piece that I'll get out one of these days called California Water Wars. But you start talking about the Getty family and a few of their friends, and Getty's basically adopted Gavin Newsom. But they own so many of the water rights in California, and that's basically how they monopolize, especially all the farm country. And it's awful, and it needs to be fixed. But it's been going on for more than a century. All right, so we've done grandfather, we've done father. Now let's do the bonesman himself. And he's not all that exciting. He's more exciting for his relatives, but as you might guess, he went to a private high school called a Hotchkiss School in Connecticut. Gets out of college, gets out of Yale, and goes back to San Francisco, and he works as a journalist and an editor at the San Francisco Examiner for 6 years.
Like CIA journalist?
Apparently, but that qualifies him. So he's gone to college, he's become a bonesman, worked 6 years as a journalist and editor, and World War II comes around, he becomes a civilian executive assistant to the general in command of the San Francisco Port of Embarkation.
So definitely CIA.
Yes, but what qualifications does this guy have? He's just been nothing but, he's got to be like, 32 years old, and he's, executive assistant for a general.
So first of all, the executive assistant, let me say a couple of things about what you just said. It would be very interesting, given his family's ties to water, obviously shipping. He knows a lot more than most 30-year-olds would about water, right? Sure. About ports, about whatever. He grew up in that industry from a little kid. That's all basically one of the main functions of his family is shipping. Okay. The executive assistant. So if you have a general officer and you want him to do a mission, the executive officer is like his right-hand man. He does the speeches for the general. He does all of the arranging of minutes, the meetings, the minutes of those meetings. He's basically like the shepherd, because I did that for a general in the Pentagon. And it is a very interesting role, especially if you're going to be the gatekeeper, because no one sees the general without going through the executive assistant.
Okay.
It's a very powerful role.
Yeah, I kind of assumed that, but my point is that, 6 years as a writer? No, okay.
So to me, everything that you described tells me 100% that he was part of this intelligence apparatus and not an actual journalist. It would be interesting to go back and see what articles he was writing and where he went to do research for those articles, because I would imagine he's gathering intelligence and therefore was more than qualified from that perspective to be that general's right-hand man.
Yeah, the other observation I was going to share is that, you get all these, especially with the World War II, you got all these guys from business or what have you, and they get appointed to all these military intelligence positions. And it's not because of their general knowledge. It's because they've got the connections to the skull and bones, and the real decision makers know they can be trusted. They are an insider.
And so they assign a handler, which is this guy, to that general to make sure that general stays in line. Interesting.
And it really does fit the pattern.
It does.
So this guy, Lewis Abbott Lapham, I'm going to say it Lapham, 1945 and 46, after the war, he becomes the president of the Pacific American Steamship Association. And then he would become the last president of the American Hawaiian Steamship Company because he screwed up, bought about 7 ships, new ships. He miscalculated the future shipping rates, and the company went bankrupt. And so he got out of the shipping business. And he joins a company called the Bankers Trust Company.
Hold on a second.
Bankers, yep.
We're supposed to believe that this guy screwed up. And again, this is just another thing that I have observed in doing all of this research. Generally, that's a story in order to be able to get those ships in the hands of someone else a lot cheaper.
Perhaps.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know. I did not do any deep homework into why the Hawaiian Steamship Company is no more. But apparently he stopped. But it did not end his career, because he goes to work for a company called the Bankers Trust Company. And he held various board positions throughout the rest of his life. And I'd like to talk about the Bankers Trust Company, because it's a name that should be more well known. As you can imagine, Bankers Trust Company, what do you think they do? Provide trust services for banks.
Correct.
So it was founded in 1903, just to exactly for that reason. Who the big New York banks in 1903? The who's who of what we've been talking about. J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, etc. The Bankers Trust had many partners, but the voting power was all held by a guy by the name of J.P. Morgan.
Okay.
Here's what gets fun. The second president of the Bankers Trust was a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Strong.
Ooh.
Who's Benjamin Strong? Well, he became the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Mm-hmm. He was also at the meeting on Jekyll Island. This guy is back right in the formation of the Fed. Benjamin Strong from Bankers Trust was there right alongside the Morgans, the Warburgs, etc. And of course, Senator Aldrich. So that's Benjamin Strong. He is known as the father of open market operations. And what that is the Federal Reserve goes out there and basically trades to stabilize markets, or to move the price of gold and the dollar around to try to stabilize things. He's the guy that scrapped the gold standard of free-floating gold in 1922. And John Maynard Keynes would cite his success in doing that and say if he'd still been there, maybe he could have avoided the Great Depression. But John Maynard Keynes is an idiot, as I like to maintain loudly. And Murray Rothbard actually disagrees. He says, no, Benjamin Strong is the guy who caused the Great Depression with his manipulation of the open market operations.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people believe.
Yeah, but this is Benjamin Strong. This is the guy.
Yeah.
And this is the bank that Mr. Lapham goes to work for, Bankers Trust. Bankers Trust would then merge with a company called Alex Brown and Sons in 1977. Who's Alex Brown and Sons? It's one of the banks of Brown Brothers Harriman. Oh, do we have another connection? That company would then be acquired by Deutsche Bank in 1999 and then sold to State Street, one of the 3 biggest asset managers on the planet, in 2003. So these are the boards of directors that Lewis Abbott Lapham sat on until the end of his life.
And Deutsche Bank is one of the biggest money launderers for the CIA.
Is it now?
Uh-huh.
Is there a bank that isn't?
They've actually been caught more than most, though.
Okay. So there's more Laphams to talk about. So we've got the grandfather, Lewis Abbott's grandfather. We've got his father. And we got Lewis Abbott himself, but he also had a couple of kids. His first son was Lewis H. Lapham, and it was pointed out in our chat earlier. He was the editor of Harper's Magazine, And he is the one that reported, interestingly enough, on the cronyism involved in the American reconstruction of Iraq. And remember we talked recently about Halliburton? And its connections with Dresser Industries?
Yes.
Now, this is Louis H. Lapham, the editor of Harper's Magazine, was the guy writing about that. So I think that apple fell a bit from the tree. He has another son by the name of Anthony A. Lapham. You're going to love him. He lived from 1936 up to 2006. He went to Yale University, but was not a Skull and Bones. His career is interesting. He works somehow. He gets his way to work for the U.S. Treasury from 1965 to 1967. He was actually the executive assistant. Remember that term, executive assistant to the Treasury Secretary. So he's the son of a bonesman from Yale, so he's pretty well connected. While he's working as the Treasury, he's also working for the Army, and he works in Army Intel with the 226th Army Intelligence Division.
Wait a minute.
Uh-huh.
What?
Yes.
So he's in the Army Reserve in an intelligence unit while he's on the staff of the Treasury.
Mm-hmm.
Which would give him access to intelligence that other people wouldn't necessarily have.
Uh-huh.
Huh. That's interesting.
Yeah. He hasn't had that exciting of a career yet, but it was a really interesting, it was worth noting.
Yeah.
Next time he shows up on our radar, and this is going to blow you away. Blew me away. Remember in 1975, we had this thing called the Church Committee?
Yes.
And they just exposed all of the CIA's dirty deeds, or a lot of the dirty deeds, including Operation Gladio, all Mockingbird, all that stuff. Well, afterwards, instead of disbanding the CIA, they needed to reform it. And so who'd they bring in? A new CIA director? None other than Skull and Bones alumni George H.W. Bush.
Right.
Well, George H.W. Bush needs a general counsel for the CIA, and guess who he picks?
Oh,
yes, Anthony A. Lapham becomes the general counsel of the CIA, the third general counsel the CIA has ever had since its formation in 1947.
So I actually have somewhere buried in one of these books some of the legal opinions that he authored, because there was a lot of questions that was asked after the Church Commission on whether or not assassinations were legal and all of that other stuff. And they offered a legal opinion that they were not legal to even do, but they still kept doing it.
Of course. This is the guy.
Wow.
Okay, so what I thought was really fascinating. He's only the third. Oh, by the way, he's considered apolitical because he served under both Ford and Carter. Now, whatever that means, he survived Carter's October massacre or Halloween massacre. What I thought was interesting is they said he's only the third general counsel the CIA's ever had in like 40 years. And I looked it up, and apparently the first general counsel was a guy by the name of Lawrence Houston. And he was the CIA general counsel from 1947 to 1973.
And he's the first one that said assassinations were not legal. The Houston guy.
Houston said they weren't.
He said they were not legal. That's correct.
Okay. Well, he retired in 73. This guy's considered one of the founding fathers of the CIA, and he actually helped draft the legislation that created the CIA.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about Houston is he served as the primary legal advisor to 9 CIA directors. Think he knows where some bodies are buried?
Yeah.
Well, that's the Lapham family for you. Pretty interesting. The thing about Anthony that really got me is if you look at his background, besides 2 years working for the Army Intelligence Division, there's nothing in his background that tells you he's qualified to be the general counsel of the CIA. except for the fact that he's the son of a bonesman. That's it. That's his only qualification to get that job.
Well, apparently it works.
Yeah, it's not what you know.
I would argue that his whole family screams CIA, but whatever.
Yeah, or definitely CIA adjacent,
Yeah.
They've been in some meetings where some tough decisions were made, that's for sure.
Yeah.
All right, I guess another fun bonesman. What a great family. Someone you wouldn't really know about, but they've been all over the place, huh?
Yeah, it's a very interesting one.
Yeah. I wonder what their kids are doing now. Because I know they have them. All right. Next one I brought up was a guy by the name of Samuel Hazard Gillespie Jr., bonesman of 1932. The only reason I bring him up is he was a lawyer for the law firm we talked about last week, Davis Polk. So you had another bonesman going to work for Davis Polk. Mm-hmm. He's actually known for arguing the Erie Railroad versus Tompkins case. And this, I'm not going to get into one of my constitutional rants, but he's a bit of a hero, Gillespie, is for what he argued on the Erie Railroad. It was something that limited government. There's not much more to know about Gillespie, but I brought up the Davis Polk connection was worth mentioning. We get to 1937. We get a bonesman by the name of Potter Stewart. Went to Yale Law instead of Harvard Law. Why do we know Potter Stewart? Well, we'll get to that in a second. He studied 1 year of international law at Cambridge. He's in another secret society besides Skull and Bones at Yale. It was an academic fraternity called Phi Delta Phi. And, Potter Stewart would become a Supreme Court Justice of the United States. That's why we know his name. Fellow alumni that were at Yale at the same time he was, that were on Phi Delta Phi, some pretty famous people in it, like Gerald Ford, Sargent Shriver, Cyrus Vance, and Byron White, who also served on the Supreme Court at the same time as Potter Stewart. So you had two classmates, both went to Yale at the same time, served on the same Supreme Court.
That's quite a class there.
Yeah.
Wow.
Uh-huh. World War II, Potter Stewart he serves as the U.S. Navy Reserve. Goes back to private practice where he came from, and of all places, he's from Cincinnati.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, people don't remember. We talked all about the Cincinnati connections of Skull and Bones, mostly with the Taft family. He actually sat on the Cincinnati City Council. His father was a former mayor of Cincinnati, like literally the successor to Taft. Then Eisenhower appoints Mr. Potter Stewart to the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in 1950-something, and then he gets nominated as SCOTUS in 1958. Best known for being the key mover behind the passage of Roe versus Wade.
So he was like one of the last things Eisenhower did if he was appointed in 58.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, served on the Warren Court, which had a lot of controversial decisions.
A lot of them. A lot of unconstitutional ones.
Yeah, and I'm furious at him over a couple of them in particular that I've done videos on. So Potter Stewart is not my favorite. He was a relatively fair guy, but I guess you would say he's liberal leaning. He'd be like I don't know. I don't even want to compare him to any of today's justices, but wasn't terrible. All right, moving on from Potter Stewart. We've got a bonesman by the name of William Horsley Orrick Jr. Orrick is O-R-R-I-C-K. He's a bonesman in 1937, and he's got a brother named Andrew Downey Orrick, who was a bonesman in 1940. Andrew Downey's easy. He is best known. He would become the San Francisco administrator for the SEC from 1954 to 1960. There's your San Francisco connection again. But William Horsley, Orrick Jr., here's some fun connections. He went to something called the Thacker School, Thacher. That was founded by Sherman Day Thatcher, whose brother was a bonesman we talked about previously. That's a private school formed by Sherman Day Thatcher. His brother was William Day, who was much more prominent. William Orrick Jr. Would then go to Stanford Business School and Berkeley School of Law. So this whole story, everything's been Eastern Seaboard. Today's group are the first times we see the shift to the West Coast, which I think is important. William Orrick Jr. would join the Army in 1942, and guess what? You're not going to believe what he ends up doing in the Army.
Intelligence.
He gets assigned to counterintelligence in San Francisco.
So he's working with the other guy.
Of course.
Okay.
Nothing too much to talk about, but his time in the Army. Post-war, he goes back to private practice in San Francisco and gets named a United States Assistant Attorney General of the Civil Division of the DOJ in 1961 and 2, and then he becomes a U.S. Undersecretary of State in 1962 to 3. Becomes an Assistant U.S. Attorney General for the Antitrust Division in 1963 to 65. Went back to private practice from 65 to 74, and then he gets nominated by Richard Nixon for the U.S. District Court in Northern California in 1974 to be a judge. He is best known for being the judge in the Patty Hearst sentencing case in 1976. Remember the Patty Hearst trial?
Oh, I do. Yes.
That's the judge, William Orrick Jr., bonesman.
Yeah, that's probably one that I need to put back on my list now that we know all of the stuff that we know, and go back and look at what that was all about.
Yeah, Patty Hearst? Yeah, I'd like to do that. And it's more than anything, I want to go back and look at the origins of yellow journalism, because William Randolph Hearst, who started the yellow journalism, there's a lot of stuff that I'd like to reread. So that's a good idea to go back and trace that one.
Yeah.
So Orrick Jr. is interesting. His brother-in-law by marriage was a guy by the name of Nicholas G. Thatcher. Same Thatcher family as the school that he went to, whose ancestor was a bonesman. Well, Nicholas G. Thatcher is interesting because you're not going to believe where he works. Oh, he worked for Bankers Trust.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Then he enters the U.S. Foreign Service from 1947 to 1970. And here's some of the places he was stationed. Karachi, Jeddah, Calcutta, Tehran. He's a deputy ambassador to Iran, and then becomes the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia in 1970 to 73.
When was he in Iran?
Just prior to that, and I think late 60s or mid 60s. I listed those in chronological order.
Okay.
But that's a 23-year career in U.S. Foreign Services in the Middle East. Think he knows anything?
Quite a bit, actually, given those stations and the destabilization that was going on.
Uh-huh. And his brother-in-law happens to be a bonesman. His grandfather's a bonesman. Yeah. See a pattern? I love the Bankers Trust. I love the Bankers Trust connection with him. And it's what we said. All of these intelligence guys, they are international bankers. They're not spies. This is how espionage is done at the highest levels. It's in a boardroom. It's not done in back alleys. Some of it, of course.
But that's the whole thing with the Sullivan and Cromwell crowd, right?
Exactly.
They all end up in intelligence, but they're really there representing the business interest of the international syndicate. But it goes back, and this keeps going back in my head since you said it originally and I knew it, but it just hadn't come out of the clouds in my brain yet. When you look back to the 1800s, and the British East and West Indies Company, they all had their own army and they had their own intelligence. And so basically all we did was take the businesses and put them in the international syndicate, and took their army, put it in the Department of Defense, and took their intelligence and put it in the CIA. And
exactly.
we intermix all of those people all of the time, which we had to have civilian control over in order to do that. And I go back to this, and I don't care what anybody says. We had never had civilian control over the War Department until 1947. The only civilian over it was the president. That bullshit in 1947, post-World War II, of putting a civilian over the War Department, destroyed the military and made it subservient to industry. And that is exactly part and parcel of that. And I'm telling you, at the strangest times, you saying that and creating that analogy of the East and West Indies, both of the Dutch and all of them, is so relevant to the setup of post-World War II and putting civilians over the Department of Defense, because you don't have the military guy in the head honcho. They subordinated it in the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff over here off to the side. He is not the official guy giving the advice. It's a civilian, and that civilian is bought and paid for by the defense industry.
Yep. And different industries have their say, and where we want our interests protected, whether it be South America or whatever. Mining companies, you got fruit companies, you got shipping companies. It's over and over and over again, same thing. And that's why you have such a revolving door at the halls of intelligence between these banks, these law firms, and the intelligence agencies. These are the ones who, all wars are banker wars. Well, all wars are investment banker wars. Not all bankers are the same. All right, I got one more Bonesman who's worth talking about. Okay. I might even be able to end with a mic drop. Which I okay. All right, this gentleman we're going to talk about is J. Richardson Dilworth, Bonesman, 1938. His family wasn't all that important. His uncle was a guy named Richardson Dilworth, who is known as the last white Anglo-Saxon Protestant mayor of Philadelphia in 1962. Interesting. Philadelphia has not had a WASP mayor since 62. J. Richardson Dilworth went to the Buckley School, Yale, Skull and Bones, 1938. Then he went to Yale Law. He joins a company by the name of Kuhn Loeb.
Oh, gosh.
Uh-huh. So he's there from 52 to 58. But let's talk about Kuhn Loeb, because that's a name everyone should know. Founded in the 1880s. It's by 1885, it is being run by a guy by the name of Jacob Schiff. Shall I repeat that? Yeah, that Jacob Schiff. He actually happens to be Loeb from Cohen Loeb's son-in-law. So that's how he got that position. The partners at the time included 4 Warburgs. And if you know anything about this story, Warburgs are all over the place, especially when it comes to the creation of the Federal Reserve. Warburgs were very tight with the Rothschilds. There's Warburgs in Germany, Warburgs in the United States. They are a big part of and Jacob Schiff. This is the firm that this guy Dilworth is joining. Kuhn Loeb used to back then. They used to finance railroads and growth companies. They were rivals of J.P. Morgan. So J.P. Morgan were the Protestant banks. Kuhn Loeb were the Jewish bankers, and they did compete quite a bit back then. And they also worked together occasionally, especially when it came to creating the Federal Reserve. But there definitely was a rivalry, and Jews like the blue blood Wall Street firms, you could, until like the World War II, you if you were Jewish, you could not work for one of them. They just would not hire you. They didn't hire blacks either. That's how those firms ran. Kuhn Loeb had a partnership with the Rockefellers to create what became the Chase Bank and later Chase Manhattan Bank, which has now been merged in with J.P. Morgan Chase. That's Kuhn Loeb. Kuhn Loeb had a glorious past. Unfortunately, they merged with Lehman Brothers in 1977. And of course, Lehman Brothers would go bankrupt in 2008 and 9. So Kuhn Loeb is no more. Unless it's been resuscitated, I'm not sure. With a name like that, they sometimes bring them back. So that's an important bank. That's who Dilworth's working for, from 52 to 58. He would serve on the board of directors of companies called the Squibb Corporation. Are you familiar with the Squibb Corporation?
Yeah.
Okay. He was also a director of Chrysler. He was a director of Macy's, among others. What he's best known for, Mr. Dilworth, though, is starting in 1956, he became the Rockefeller family's financial advisor.
Which is where I found him in Thy Will Be Done's book about Nelson Rockefeller and his basically warmongering throughout Latin America. This guy Dilworth comes up a lot, especially as it had to do with the Rockefeller Center, because that was a Nelson Rockefeller and his mom's. He had a really weird relationship with his mom that's very well detailed in that book, and it evolved around the Rockefeller Center and this art project and all kinds of crazy stuff. And Dilworth came up often in that whole conversation.
Very good. Yeah, we could spend a lot of time on Dilworth and all the things he was involved with the Rockefellers. But as you can see, Rockefellers they show up in just about every one of these stories in some way, shape, or form. Let's just figure out how they tie into another one. So he had like his right-hand man, he had an employee, Dilworth did. And this employee's name was William Thaddeus Coleman Jr. Oh, you know who that is?
I do.
Yeah, this is the guy. This is my mic drop. So Dilworth's assistant, William Thaddeus Coleman Jr., was the assistant counsel to the Warren Commission that investigated JFK's assassination. That's the mic drop. That is your Rockefeller connection to the JFK assassination people. Or at least the cover-up.
Yeah, and that, so you have the guy, and again, this goes back unbeknownst to me to the conversation we had at the very beginning, right? These executive assistants. They are one of the most crucially important roles that these people have in their lives. They are the gatekeepers for these people. They're incredibly important. And you have a dyed-in-the-wool Rockefeller disciple here. And keep in mind, because you have to span out for your mic drop, the Rockefellers with United Fruit, with Standard Oil, with their tentacles in everything around the world, JFK, and keep in mind this, for those of you who have watched my ranting on the importance of Indonesia to the murder of JFK, Rockefeller had finagled a 60% stake in the purest oil found covertly in Indonesia that had been, it was the biggest oil field, the most purest oil field in the entire world to that date. That was founded in the 1930s. And when Rockefeller, through their intelligence network, found it, they connived their way in because at the time, that was a Dutch colony, Indonesia, and they finagled their way into getting 60% share in that find. But it had not been drilled yet because Sukarno was in charge of Indonesia and was a neutralist and was not going to allow the West to monopolize his resources. So the CIA got called to overthrow Sukarno, and they tried multiple times. JFK befriended Sukarno and had already set up a meeting in January of 1964 to go and meet with him, but he never did. And Sukarno had already visited the White House because they knew if JFK and him got if JFK visited Indonesia, it would recognize Sukarno and increase his importance, which would then decrease the chance of overthrowing him. And they could not allow that meeting to occur. So this is Rockefeller. Rockefeller had massive investments on hold waiting to get rid of JFK. Now say what you just said again about this guy's executive assistant. What role did he play?
Was the assistant counsel to the Warren Commission, which should be known as the Assassination Cover-Up Commission.
It's just fascinating to me because this is so true. So when JFK changed everything about foreign aid, when he changed everything about, he basically did, and I know people are going to hate me for saying this, but he basically meant to do a lot of what Jimmy Carter did as far as tying foreign aid to human rights. And he was trying to overhaul all of those different things, set up the Peace Corps in order to have good people represent America around the world, not intelligence assets, which they took it over as soon as they killed him. And so JFK was an existential threat to the Rockefellers and their, especially Nelson Rockefeller in Latin America. That's a whole nother thing. But if you just look at the Rockefeller family in general, they had exploited people and resources all over the world, and JFK was stopping it. And then his executive assistant is one of the general counsels, and how pivotal the general counsel role is in the Warren Commission, because they're the ones that determines who gets called in for witnesses, what the questions are going to be asked of the witnesses.
More importantly, who doesn't get called in.
Correct.
Yeah.
And what gets put into the record as far as evidence, all of that stuff. They are the orchestra conductor. And he has a direct tie to the fucking Rockefellers. That is crazy.
I think that's a pretty good mic drop for today, huh?
It is definitely probably the best mic drop we've had so far in the series.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, I'll accept that praise. You know, the part that gets me about Dilworth, you know, he's sitting there from 1956 onwards as the financial advisor for the whole Rockefeller family, all of the foundations and trusts, because there's a bunch of them. And we use the term Rockefeller as it's singular, but there's more than one. They just all work together. So it's just the Rockefeller family. When we say Rockefeller, it's not even worth the time to memorize their names because they're interchangeable. But what gets me is he was there in all the meetings, and you've heard me talk about this, the four horsemen of the fake climate apocalypse. In the late 60s, the Rockefellers had four stooges, or four disciples, that all led to this whole Great Reset.
Yeah.
It was Kissinger, Brzezinski, Maurice Strong from Canada, who worked at the United Nations, and of course Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum. All four of those guys would have been sitting in meetings with Dilworth. And that changed the world in the early 70s when those four guys launched this idea. They opened up China. They started all this green nonsense, the climate alarmism, all of that. You know, we had Brzezinski's, what was it, the devil's, what's it, grand chessboard? All that stuff started happening. It all came from Rockefeller offices, and Dilworth was there.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And let me just emphasize something you just said about the collateral trust funds that they set up, the funds, foundations. As the financial advisor, he would have basically been the manager of all of those. He would have had a presence on all of those. And they were basically like Carnegie Endowment, all of those, the Ford Foundation, those were used to fund CIA operations on their behalf. That was a way of channeling donations to USAID. Go back and look at USAID and National Endowment for Democracy, and look how many Rockefeller grants were issued to these private, non-private, government billed as non-government organizations to do this coups in foreign, and there's a direct line. And this is the guy sitting at all of the meetings.
Yeah. And you talk about the foundations. We're going to have to do a deep dive into foundations, but I want to remind everyone about this. These are known as tax-free foundations, and the whole concept of them was created right around 1910, 1911. The very first two tax-free foundations was the Carnegie and the Rockefeller foundations. Those are the same time they were sending their own representative to Jekyll Island to concoct this thing called the Federal Reserve and implement in 1913 the income tax on the rest of us. So you've got these robber barons with generational wealth. They're able to hide all of it behind what's called a tax-free foundation structure, and under the guise of doing charitable work. But we just demonstrated ad nauseum that it's anything but charitable. What they've been doing is using this fake shell company or shells to basically fund foreign policy on behalf of the international syndicate, their own business interests around the world. They don't have to pay taxes, but we do. And quite often you'll see U.S. tax dollars will go into this foundation before they ship it to an NGO. That's the way the circle works. And we are paying for it. This is one of the biggest heists ever pulled on the world, was in 1910 to 1913 with these tax-free foundations. And you ought to be, if you're not furious, then you didn't hear me right, or I didn't explain it well enough, because you should be pissed.
You explained it very well. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. It is they set up a system where they increase their rich at our expense every single time. Yeah.
It was done right in front of us. And we just showed a bunch of common connections, not only in today's world, but all the way back to Jekyll Island with Benjamin Strong.
Yeah, so you did an excellent job today, Brady, outlining all of that. And of course, the takeaway for me is you have this structure, which I think that's kind of the beauty of this. And I don't know if we've actually said this out loud. You are describing the international syndicate while I'm describing the Operation Gladio aspects of it. So it inserts at every single one of these bonesmen. There's an input to every single one of them, like basically the stealing of Hawaii, and all of those things insert along the way. Indonesia, the involvement in the JFK assassination. Those are all Gladio operations, but you have outlined the structure of the bonesmen in the international syndicate. And when you lay the two side by side, you can't ignore the fact that this international syndicate is using this paramilitary operation in order to perpetuate their resource stealing domination of the world.
And we haven't even gotten to the Atlantic side of it, the other side of the Atlantic yet, because that's where it comes from.
Well, and I think I'm going to nominate, and we can talk about this later, but I think the organization that best illustrates that is the Pilgrim Society.
I have not gone deep enough in there yet, but are you suggesting I need to start doing my homework because we need to go there?
I am telling you that the bridge to the UK is the Pilgrim Society. The Pilgrim Society was born out of the Fabian Society, and it mirrors the RIIA and the CFRs.
Okay. If that's the case, then I'm 100% in agreement, because I didn't have the name for that, which you just described. I just knew that it had happened. We talked a couple weeks ago. I talked about the what did we call them? The dollar princesses.
Yes.
Where we had these wealthy American heiresses married into the British royalty, or big names there.
You are going to see that. And do you know whose dad was a member of the Pilgrim Society? Somebody actually provided me with the proof. Tucker Carlson's dad was one of the Pilgrim Societies.
He most certainly had a lot of intelligence connections.
Yeah. No doubt about it. Yeah, I'm going to nominate that for our next one, because that'll bridge us over there.
Okay, so we've got to finish up Skull and Bones. Probably another 2 weeks worth of characters.
Yep.
spend some time on the foundations because we have to. Then we'll go to Pilgrim Society and jump over the ocean.
Okay.
I'm good to go. Oh, this is a lot of fun. This was a lot of fun as always. And the audience was great. Really good comments. Thanks, everyone.
And Brady, congratulations on your upcoming marriage. I hope everything goes, and give Alexa my best.
Will do. I got to survive the next 50 hours, and then you can congratulate me. As long as I don't screw up. As long as I don't screw up for 2 days.
I have my faith in you. And just so that you guys know, this is a perfect time to do it. Tell everybody how you found me.
Oh, well, my soon-to-be, my bride-to-be was on True Social and said, you got to check out this gal on True Social, which I didn't spend much time on Truth at the time. I might have had like 10 followers. And I go, why? She goes, oh, she talks about the same stuff you talk about. I go, oh, really? So I start reading. I make a couple comments. It took us about 5 exchanges to realize we were on the same page. And I don't know, within a few weeks, we're talking on the phone and just having the time of our lives. I think our first phone call was like 3 hours long.
Yeah. So his future wife, wonderful woman, is what got Brady and I together. Mm-hmm. So God bless her.
And you won't find her on social media. She just follows a few accounts that she likes, and you're one of them.
Yeah,
I don't think she
obviously very flattered. A brilliant woman, and smart enough to pick Brady as her future husband. So congratulations again.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone. See you next week.
See you later.